Sakamoto Days is a battle shonen, so by nature, characters are constantly fighting each other. And while some characters may get into some bad matchups from time to time, only one character has had the unfortunate chance of going up against the two strongest characters in the series, and that character is Gaku. Gaku, from his introduction back in chapter 50, has only participated in 3 fights. During his invasion of the JAA base, he went up against Fodder, and then got fodderized by Takamura. Later in the JCC exams, he infiltrates the Tassis Shinaya, going up against Shin, Toramaru, Mafuyu, Kaiji, and then an angry Sakamoto, once again getting bodied. Lastly, in the most recent museum arc, Gaku enters the museum, trounces the guards in Samijima, and then loses to Nagumo. Gaku has pretty much only taken L's during his time in the series, and yet people still regard him as crazy strong. Of course, the reason for this is pretty obvious. If you look back at the list of people Gaku has lost to, you have 2 characters pretty collectively regarded to be the 2 strongest right now, being Takamura and Nagumo, and then you have Sakamoto, who was formerly the strongest and is still a powerhouse. So Gaku losing to any of those characters is by no means a knock on his strength, since 99% of the verse would also be losing to these characters. On top of that, Gaku was legitimately giving Nagumo a pretty tough time, so much so that Nagumo called him the best he's ever fought, and even managed to almost make a comeback after being hit with Nagumo's invisible blade. That being said, because of Gaku's tendency to only fight the strongest in the series and thus losing to them, many readers have started comparing him to another character that also only fights the strongest and also takes L's to them, that being Jogo from Jujutsu Kaisen. Jogo is introduced in chapter 10 and showcases his strength by burning a bunch of civilians. But in his first real fight, he gets cooked by Gojo and has so much trauma that in Shibuya, he's literally threatening to kill Choso if he doesn't help him hold off Gojo, and refuses to enter a domain clash with someone he considers stronger than him. Later that same arc, Jogo unfortunately comes face to face with the actual strongest character in JJK, that being Sukuna, and even though he isn't at 20 fingers, Sukuna still effortlessly bodies Jogo. And much like Gaku, Jogo only really participates in 3 fights during his run in the series. To add to this parallel, many consider Jogo to be a sort of sleeper pick in terms of strength, since his power is constantly overshadowed by the people he fights. However, it's at this point that the parallels stop. For one, Jogo is dead and has been dead for like the past 141 chapters, whereas Gaku, as of the Okutabi Museum arc, isn't confirmed dead, and I still believe he has a much bigger role to play for the rest of the story. On top of that, while Gaku and Jogo are both quite strong in their respective verses, relative to the rest of the characters in each series, there's a clear difference. The reason people have dubbed it the Jogo effect is because Jogo's strength is constantly overshadowed by the people he fights. People consistently downplay and underestimate Jogo's strength because his showings always look pathetic compared to the likes of Gojo and Sukuna. The same cannot be said for Gaku. After his fight with Nagumo, Gaku was pretty much universally regarded to be high order level, and for good reason. Especially with X's statement about Nagumo being top 2 in the order, Gaku's performance against him was put in a new light. Unlike Jogo, I don't see very many people underestimating Gaku. Instead, I've seen several place him easily within the top 10 strongest in the verse, with him outranking nearly every order member except for Nagumo and Takamura, and that is for obvious reasons. The Gaku glazing has exploded into a new scale, with some of it deserved and some of it not so deserved. But the main thing I wanted to highlight is the contrast between how people view Jogo and how people view Gaku. Jogo, he's respectably strong, but not necessarily near the top of the verse. But with Gaku, there's a legitimate argument to be made that he's in the top 10 strongest and would clear 99% of all people he came across. Another breakage in the Gaku and Jogo parallels is in their story relevance. Jogo only really makes himself relevant through Shibuya, and even then, he isn't really as large of a player in those arcs. His main contributions to the story include acting as a jobber for Gojo to showcase his domain and some of his abilities, and then acting as a jobber to Sukuna to showcase his fire arrow and general strength. This is in stark contrast to Gaku, who I would argue is never really written with the primary purpose of being fodder for stronger characters. From Gaku's introduction, it was made apparent that he is immensely strong. Throughout the whole invasion of the JAA base, Gaku kept a bored, deadpan expression as he tore through the employees. Him and X are literally comparing their acts of domestic terrorism to showing up to school with a new haircut. Of course, this coupled with Gaku casually one-shotting everyone he comes across really demonstrates to readers that his strength was a cut above the rest. Even as he gets bodied by Takamura, readers never really got the impression that Gaku was weak for it, especially since the most emotion he showed during the whole thing was a slight smile after his mace got broken. This reinforcement of his strength also comes afterwards when X tells Gaku that he's probably the first person to make it back alive from a fight with Takamura. Similarly, in Gaku's next two fights, we always get a reminder of how strong he is. Even as he's dealing with a half second of lag, a limited space for moving, and is fighting a 4v1, Gaku is still cooking Shin, Mafuyu, Toramaru, and Kaiji during the JCZ exams. When he finally goes up against Sakamoto, Gaku has already reminded readers of his strength, so him getting bodied is less of an anti-feat. And with his fight against Nagumo, he does incredibly well, being able to keep Nagumo on his toes and deal significant damage throughout the duration of the fight. All of Gaku's showings up to this point have been to highlight his strength, not to act as fodder for someone stronger. And of course, considering the fact that Gaku isn't dead yet, or at least isn't confirmed dead, it would be reasonable to say that Gaku has far more story relevance than someone like Jogo. Many people are under the assumption that Shin will eventually get strong enough to take on Gaku, probably by the end of the series, and that's something I agree with. Their rivalry was already somewhat set up in the JCZ exam arc, and it makes sense as Gaku is to X what Shin is to Sakamoto, and the two sides have been set up to fight each other at some point. All of this yapping is to say that, while I understand that Gaku and Jogo share some level of similarity due to their tendency to only take L's fighting the strongest of their respective verses, that parallel is only surface level. Gaku's strength is much higher relative to the other characters in a series. He isn't written with the purpose of getting cooked to showcase other characters' strengths, and his overall plot relevance continues to be seen since he isn't dead and still has much more to do within the story. One thing that I can say for both Jogo and Gaku though, is that they both are arguably the unluckiest characters of their respective series.